The air backstage was thick and electric, a chaotic soup of nervous energy and cheap hairspray. It was the kind of noise that felt physical, a buzzing vibration that settled deep in your bones. In one corner, a group of girls in matching sparkly tops were practicing a high-kick routine, their laughter sharp and confident. Near the curtain, a band with ripped jeans and faded t-shirts was arguing over a guitar chord, the sound of their electric instrument cutting through everything else with a jagged whine. This was the world of the annual high school talent show, a place for the bold, the popular, the ones who craved the spotlight like a plant craves the sun. And in the furthest, darkest corner, far from the light and the noise, sat a girl who wanted none of it. She was perched on a small, wobbly wooden stool, almost swallowed by the shadow of a large equipment case. The case was black and scuffed, covered in stickers from obscure classical music competitions and a peeling label from a long-forgotten music camp. It was her fortress, and she was its sole inhabitant. Her name was not important to the bustling crowd around her. To them, she was just the quiet girl with the big cello. She kept her eyes down, focused on a loose thread on her jeans, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her heart was beating a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs, a silent drum solo that no one else could hear. She had signed up on a whim, a moment of pure, foolish bravery that now felt like a terrible mistake. What was she thinking? She didn't belong here. These people were performers. She was just a player. There was a difference. They lived for the applause. She lived for the moments when the music was so loud and all-consuming that she couldn't hear anything else. Not even her own thoughts. A group of guys swaggered past, their laughter booming. They were the undisputed kings of this social jungle, led by a boy with an easy smile and a confident walk that seemed to part the very air in front of him. He was the kind of person who never had to try too hard. Everything, from his messy hair to his casual lean against a wall, seemed perfectly calculated. He was with his usual circle, a pack of followers who hung on his every word and laughed at his every joke. Their own identities blurred into his. They were scanning the room, their eyes taking in the scene, categorizing everyone into either one of us or one of them. Their gaze slid over the dancing girls, the arguing band, and then it stopped. It landed on her, the strange, still figure in the corner with the enormous black case. The leader of the group nudged his friend, a smirk playing on his lips. Well, what have we got here?" He said, his voice a low murmur meant for his pack but loud enough to carry. One of his friends snickered. "Looks like someone's lost. I think the library is that way." They chuckled, a shared moment of casual cruelty that was as natural to them as breathing. They saw her not as a person but as an oddity, a prop in their ongoing entertainment. The girl felt their eyes on her like a physical weight, and she shrank back, wishing she could melt into the wall and disappear. She pulled her knees closer to her chest, making herself smaller, but the leader wasn't done. He was bored, and she was a new distraction. He pushed himself off the wall and began to walk slowly toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. His friends followed, forming a loose, intimidating semicircle around her corner. The girl could feel her throat tighten. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the stool. She didn't look up, but she could see his worn-out sneakers stop in front of her. She could smell the faint scent of cologne and something else, something like confidence. "Hey," he said. His voice wasn't mocking, not directly. It was smooth, friendly almost, which somehow made it worse. It was the voice of a hunter who didn't want to startle his prey. She didn't answer. She just stared at his shoes. He cleared his throat, a gentle sound that was still a demand. "I didn't know you played," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the black case. "That's a cello, right?" A muffled giggle came from one of his friends. They all knew what it was. They just wanted to make her say it. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Her mouth felt dry, like it was full of cotton. The boy crouched down, bringing himself to her level. He tried to catch her eye, but she kept her gaze fixed on the floor. "That's actually really cool," he said, and the words were like poison wrapped in sugar. "Not many people play the cello. It's different." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Different." In their world, different was just another way of saying weird. He could see he was getting to her. He could see the way her shoulders trembled, just slightly. He fed on that small sign of weakness. You know, he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the crowd out there, they're getting a little bored with all the same old stuff. You know, pop songs, dance routines. He gestured vaguely back toward the band. Something like this. It would really shake things up? One of his friends chimed in, his voice dripping with fake enthusiasm. Yeah, man. It would be like super classy. Another one added, a real culture moment for our school. They were barely holding back their laughter. The joke was clear. She was the joke. She was the weird, boring act that would clear the room, the perfect punchline to their evening. They were daring her, not with words, but with the entire weight of their social presence. They were setting her up to fail, to be humiliated in front of everyone. They wanted to see her walk out on that stage and freeze, to hear the whispers and the bored shuffling of feet. It was their idea of fun. The girl remained silent, her face a blank mask. But inside, a storm was raging. A hot, prickling feeling of shame and anger was rising in her chest. She hated them. She hated their easy confidence, their casual cruelty, the way they moved through the world as if they owned it. And a part of her, a tiny defiant part, hated herself for letting them make her feel so small. She had spent years in the background, perfecting her music, finding a voice in the deep, resonant notes of her instrument. It was the one place where she felt powerful, where she could say things without ever speaking a word. And now, they were trying to take that away from her too. They were trying to turn her one true passion into a spectacle for their amusement. The boy stood up, sensing he had won. He straightened his jacket and gave her one last charming smile. You should totally do it, he said, his voice back to its normal volume. Go for it. We'll be cheering for you. It was the final twist of the knife. He and his friends turned and walked away, their laughter echoing back to her. She listened to their retreating footsteps, the sound of her own heartbeat still pounding in her ears. She was left alone in the corner, the silence they left behind even louder than the noise they had made. She looked down at the scuffed black case, her fingers tracing the worn-out handle. She felt a wave of nausea, the urge to just pack up and go home, to disappear and never come back. But then, that tiny spark of defiance flared up again, a small, hot coal in the cold ashes of her fear. They thought she was a joke. They wanted to see her fail. A slow, hard resolve began to form in her mind. She took a deep, shaky breath, and for the first time all night, she lifted her head and looked toward the stage, a flicker of something like determination in her eyes. She would play. And she would play for herself. The resolve that had settled in her mind was not a warm, comforting fire. It was more like a block of ice, cold and heavy in her stomach. It didn't give her courage. It just gave her a direction. She pushed herself up from the wobbly stool, her legs feeling strangely distant, as if they belonged to someone else. The scuffed black case seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, a physical anchor to the decision she had just made. Every step toward the stage felt like walking through deep water. The chaotic energy of backstage swirled around her, but it was like watching a movie with the sound off. She was in her own bubble, a silent, determined world where the only thing that mattered was the next step, and the next. And the next. She could see the heavy red velvet curtain that separated the chaos from the performance. A stagehand with a headset and a bored expression gave her a quick, dismissive glance. You're up after the next act, he mumbled into his clipboard, not even looking at her. She just nodded, her throat too tight to form words. She stood there in the wings, a shadow in the darkness, and watched the end of the current performance. A dance group finished with a series of high-energy spins and poses, and the crowd erupted in cheers and whistles. The sound washed over her, a wave of approval for everything she was not. They were bright, loud, and confident. She was quiet, dark, and terrified. As the dancers ran off stage, laughing and high-fiving each other, the stagehand gave her a little shove. Go on, he said. It wasn't mean, just impatient. The show had to go on. She stepped through the gap in the curtain, And the world changed instantly. The first thing that hit her was the light. It wasn't just bright. It was a physical force. It was hot and white, and it blinded her, turning the entire auditorium into a black void. She couldn't see faces, only the vague, dark shapes of hundreds of people hidden beyond the glare. It was disorienting, but also a strange kind of relief. If she couldn't see them, maybe they couldn't really see her. She was just a silhouette, a girl with a big instrument, walking across a vast, empty space. The second thing that hit her was the sound. Or rather, the lack of the right kind of sound. The applause for the dancers had faded, and now there was a low, rumbling noise that filled the air. It was the sound of a crowd settling, of people talking to their friends, of candy wrappers being crinkled, of phones being taken out to check messages. It was the sound of indifference. They were waiting for the next real act to start. To them, she was just the filler, the awkward pause between the exciting parts. A voice boomed through the speakers, a voice that was far too cheerful and practiced. And now, folks, for something a little different. A change of pace. The announcer's tone was the verbal equivalent of a pat on the head. It was the kind of voice you used for a child's piano recital, not a serious performance. Please welcome to the stage. She be playing the cello for you tonight. Let's give her a big Northwood High welcome. A smattering of applause followed. It was thin and polite, the kind of sound people make when they feel obligated. It was the sound of a joke being set up. She could feel it in the air. She knew exactly where the boy and his friends were sitting, not because she could see them, but because she could feel their collective gaze, a hot, anticipatory spotlight of its own. They were leaning forward in their seats, their smirks already in place, waiting for the show to begin. They had front row seats to her humiliation. She walked slowly to the center of the stage, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. She placed the heavy case down on the floor, the sound a dull thud that was swallowed by the ongoing chatter of the crowd. For a moment she just stood there, a lone figure under the blinding lights, her plain jeans and simple sweater feeling like a costume she hadn't chosen. She was the antithesis of the glittering, confident performers who had come before her, with hands that were surprisingly steady. She knelt and opened the case. The familiar scent of old wood, rosin, and years of practice rose up to meet her. It was the smell of her sanctuary, the one place in the world where she felt completely herself. She reached in and her fingers found the smooth, curved wood of her cello. It was an old instrument, passed down from her grandmother, with scratches and dings that each had a story. It was not a flashy, pristine thing. It was a workhorse, a friend. A vessel for all the things she couldn't say. She lifted it out, the weight of it a familiar comfort against her body. She clicked the end pin into place, the sharp sound cutting through the dull roar of the audience for a split second. She sat down on the simple wooden stool that had been left for her, positioning the cello between her knees. It felt right. It felt like coming home. She took a moment to tune it, her fingers plucking the strings, each note a clear, pure bell in the noisy air. The chatter in the audience didn't stop. A few people looked up, curious for a second, then went back to their conversations. From the darkness of the auditorium, the boy watched her. He nudged his friend. "Dude, this is gonna be hilarious," he whispered, his voice full of gleeful anticipation. "It's like watching a librarian try to DJ." His friend stifled a laugh. They couldn't see her face, hidden behind the curtain of her hair, but they could see her posture, the way she seemed to shrink into the large instrument. To them, she looked small and out of place, exactly as they had intended. They were ready for the slow, boring classical piece they could mock, the perfect background music for their whispered jokes. They had no idea that the girl on the stage was no longer listening to them. She was no longer even thinking about them. She closed her eyes. The noise of the crowd, the lights, the feeling of being exposed, it all started to fade away. She was no longer a scared girl on a stage in front of a mocking crowd. She was just a musician with her instrument. She took a deep, slow breath, filling her lungs completely. The air felt calm and cool. In her mind, she was not in the school auditorium anymore. She was in her room with the door closed, the world shut out. She was alone with the music, The shy, timid girl who had been dared onto the stage was still there, somewhere, but she was no longer in charge. The musician was in charge now. The musician who had a story to tell. She opened her eyes, a new focus in her gaze, and slowly, deliberately, she raised the bow. The restless audience had no idea that their joke was about to be shattered into 1,000 pieces of absolute silence. The world had shrunk to the space between her body and the worn wood of the cello. The blinding lights, the vast, dark room, the hundreds of unseen faces, all of it had receded, fading into a distant, irrelevant buzz. There was only the smooth, cool feel of the instrument against her knees, the firm grip of her left hand on the neck, and the delicate balance of the bow in her right. She was no longer the girl who had been dared onto a stage. She was a conduit, a vessel, and the story she was about to tell had been building inside her for a long, long time. It was a story of feeling small, of being overlooked, of a quiet anger that had smoldered for years. And now it was finally time to let it out. Her right arm moved, not with a musician's precision, but with a slow, deliberate grace. The bow, a simple stick of wood strung with coarse horsehair, descended toward the strings. It seemed to take an eternity, traveling through the thick, still air. In the audience, the low rumble of conversation continued. A girl in the third row was telling her friend about a fight she'd had with her boyfriend. A couple in the back was sharing a box of candy, the crinkle of the wrapper a small, sharp sound in the general din. The popular guy who had set this all in motion was leaning back in his seat, a smirk already fixed on his face, ready to nudge his friend at the first awkward, mournful note. He was expecting a lullaby, a boring piece of classical music that would be the perfect soundtrack for their whispered jokes. He was waiting for his punchline. Then the bow touched the string. It wasn't a note, it was an event. It was a physical presence that exploded into the auditorium, a deep, resonant, and impossibly rich tone that seemed to have more weight than sound. It didn't just cut through the noise, it erased it. It was like a thunderclap in a library, a sudden, shocking force that commanded absolute attention. The girl in the third row stopped talking mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open. A couple in the back froze, the candy box forgotten in their hands. The crinkle of the wrapper was swallowed by a sound so much bigger, so much more powerful than anything they had expected. For a split second, there was a wave of confusion. People's heads snapped forward, their eyes trying to focus on the lone figure on the stage. Where was that sound coming from? It was too raw, too full of a dark, driving energy to be coming from a cello. It sounded more like a roar, a cry from somewhere deep and ancient. The smirk on the popular guy's face vanished, replaced by a look of sheer bewilderment. He sat up straight, his body tensing. This wasn't part of the joke. This wasn't funny. This was something else entirely. The first note hung in the air, vibrating with a raw, untamed emotion, and then came the second and the third. She wasn't playing a simple, sweet melody. She was unleashing a torrent of sound, a complex and haunting tapestry of music that was both frantic and controlled. Her bow moved with a fierce, almost violent grace, dancing across the strings, pulling out a cascade of notes that were at times heart-pounding and aggressive, and at others aching with a profound and delicate sorrow. She wasn't just reading notes on a page. She was pouring every ounce of her being into the instrument. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her face a mask of intense concentration and raw feeling. Her body swayed with the music, not in a practiced, performative way, but with a natural, rhythmic motion that showed she was completely lost in the sound. She was one with the cello, and together they were telling a story that everyone in the room could suddenly understand. Even without words, the silence that followed the initial shock was total and absolute. It was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the empty silence of indifference. It was a heavy, full silence, packed with awe and wonder. The restless shuffling of feet had ceased. The glow of phone screens, which had dotted the darkened room like artificial stars, had disappeared. No one was recording, no one was texting, no one was even breathing loudly. Every single person in the auditorium was held captive, their attention locked on the girl and the impossible music she was creating. The melody twisted and turned, taking the audience on a journey they hadn't signed up for. It spoke of loneliness, of being an outsider looking in. There were passages of music that felt like running a desperate, frantic sprint to escape something unseen. Then it would shift, dropping into a low, mournful lament that was so full of pain it was almost unbearable to listen to, and yet impossible to turn away from. It was the sound of every uncried tear, every unspoken frustration, every moment of feeling invisible. And in that moment, she wasn't invisible anymore. She was the most visible person in the world. From his seat, the popular guy stared, his mouth slightly agape. The joke was long gone, erased from his mind by the sheer, overwhelming power of the performance. He looked around at the rest of the audience, at the faces illuminated by the stage lights, and saw the same expression of shock and captivation everywhere. He saw the girl in the third row, her hand now covering her mouth, her eyes wide with emotion. He saw the teacher who had been scrolling through her phone, now leaning forward, her elbows on her knees, completely engrossed. He had wanted to create a moment of awkwardness, a small, cruel bubble of entertainment for himself and his friends. Instead, he had accidentally created a moment of profound, collective experience. He had set out to make a fool of her, and in doing so had given her the stage to make a fool of everyone who had ever underestimated her. The silence was no longer his weapon. It was her victory. And as the first powerful movement of the piece began to build toward its climax, he realized, with a strange and humbling feeling, that he was just one of the many sitting in the dark and listening. The silence that had fallen over the auditorium was not an empty silence. It was a living, breathing thing, a shared space filled with the echoes of the first powerful notes. It was the kind of quiet that happens in a forest just before a storm breaks, a moment of held breath where the entire world seems to be listening. The girl on the stage, her eyes still closed, was the storm's center. The music that flowed from her cello was no longer just a sound. It was an atmosphere, a presence that filled every corner of the room, wrapping itself around every person in the audience. The initial shock had given way to a deep, rapt attention. The music had shifted, moving from that first explosive cry into something more complex, more narrative. It was a story told in notes, a story without words but with more meaning than any speech. There were passages that were fast and frantic, the bow flying across the strings in a blur of motion. The sound was sharp and angry, like a heated argument in a language everyone understood instinctively. It spoke of frustration, of running down corridors that never ended, of shouting into a void and hearing nothing back. In the audience, people found themselves tensing their muscles, their own feelings of restlessness and impatience mirrored in the frantic melody. A young teacher in the back, who had been grading papers just minutes before, now had her pen frozen in her hand, her mind far from the red marks on the page. She was remembering her own teenage years, the feeling of being misunderstood, the desperate need to be heard. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm would pass. The frantic pace would slow, the angry notes would soften, and a new melody would emerge. This one was different. It was quiet, heartbreakingly so. It was a simple, pure line of sound that felt like a single tear tracing a path down a cheek. It was the sound of loneliness, of sitting by a window and watching the world go on without you. It was so full of a gentle, aching sadness that it was almost unbearable to listen to, and yet no one could look away. It was a shared sadness, a universal feeling that connected everyone in the room. In the third row, the girl, who had been gossiping about her boyfriend, now had her hand pressed to her chest, her own eyes welling up with tears she didn't understand. The music was touching a part of her she kept hidden, a part of her that felt the same quiet ache. From his seat near the front, the popular boy watched, completely mesmerized. The smirk was long gone, wiped clean from his face by the sheer force of the performance. He felt a strange and unfamiliar sensation in his chest, a tightening that was both painful and strangely comforting. He had set out to mock this girl, to turn her into a punchline for a cheap laugh. He had seen her as quiet, awkward, and therefore an easy target. But the person on the stage was not quiet or awkward. She was fierce, she was passionate, she was pouring out a universe of emotion that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. He was seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her. and the sight was humbling. He looked at his friends who were sitting beside him, their usual confident slouches replaced by rigid, attentive postures. They weren't smirking. They weren't whispering. They were just like him, completely captivated. The joke was over. In fact, it felt like it had never even been a joke at all. It felt like a distant, foolish memory from another lifetime. A hot, prickly feeling of shame started to creep up his neck. He thought about the way he had spoken to her, the condescending tone in his voice, the way he and his friends had laughed at her expense. It all seemed so small, so petty, so incredibly stupid now. He had wanted to make her feel small, but in the blinding glow of the stage lights, she seemed larger than life, and he was the one who felt tiny, insignificant. He was just one of the many sitting in the dark, and finally, truly listening, the music began to build again. The quiet, melancholic melody started to gain strength, the notes becoming fuller, more determined. It was no longer a cry of sadness, but a declaration of resilience. It was the sound of someone finding their voice, of standing up after being knocked down, of deciding that they were no longer willing to be invisible. The girl's body began to move more, her swaying becoming more pronounced, her left hand flying up and down the neck of the cello with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. Her right arm drove the bow into the strings with a renewed power, pulling out a sound that was triumphant, defiant, and utterly beautiful. The entire auditorium was with her on this journey. It was as if they were all holding their breath together, waiting for what came next. The silence was no longer just attentive. It was participatory. The audience was a part of the performance, their collective energy fueling the music, their shared emotion giving it meaning. They were no longer a crowd of individuals. They were a single entity, united by the sound of a single girl and her cello. The boy who had dared her felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't just watching a performance anymore. He was witnessing a transformation. He was seeing the quiet, overlooked girl he had tried to mock become a force of nature right before his very eyes. And as the music soared to its peak, a dizzying, breathtaking crescendo of sound and feeling, he realized something else. He wasn't just sorry for what he had done. He was grateful. He was grateful that his stupid, cruel prank had, by some strange twist of fate, given this girl the stage and given all of them the chance to hear her. The joke had truly turned into silence, and in that silence he had found something he never knew he was looking for. The music reached its peak, a dizzying, breathtaking crescendo that felt like it might tear the very fabric of the air. It was the sound of a soul breaking free, a triumphant roar that was both beautiful and terrifying. On the stage, the girl was no longer sitting still. Her entire body was part of the performance, her back arched, her head thrown back, the bow a blur of motion in her hand. She was pouring every last drop of her energy, her history, her pain, and her strength into the final moments of the piece. The cello was no longer just an instrument. It was an extension of her voice, singing a song that everyone in the room understood in their own way. It was the song of the underdog, the outcast, the quiet one who finally found a way to be heard. And then, as the music soared to its absolute highest, most powerful point, it stopped. She drew the bow across the strings one last time, pulling out a single, piercing note that was so pure and so full of emotion it seemed to hang in the air like a star. It didn't fade away quickly. It lingered, vibrating through the rafters, through the seats, and through the very bones of everyone in the auditorium. It was a sound that demanded to be felt, not just heard. And as that final note finally began to soften, disappearing into the heavy atmosphere, something incredible happened. Nothing happened. For 3 full seconds, the auditorium was utterly, completely silent. It was a silence so profound it was louder than any applause. It was the kind of sacred, shared quiet that falls over a crowd when they have just witnessed something truly extraordinary. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if they were afraid that any sound, any movement, would break the spell and shatter the memory of what they had just experienced. The air was thick with unshed tears and unspoken thoughts. In the third row, the girl who had been crying now sat perfectly still, her hand still pressed to her heart, her eyes wide with a sense of wonder. The teacher in the back had put down her pen completely, her face illuminated by the stage lights, a look of deep, emotional resonance on her face. From his seat near the front, the popular boy was frozen. The music had stopped, but it was still playing in his head, echoing in the empty spaces he hadn't even known were there. The shame he had felt earlier had deepened into something else, something more profound. It was a humbling, soul-crushing awe. He saw the girl on the stage, her head bowed, her chest heaving with exhaustion, and he saw not a joke, not a weirdo, not a target. He saw an artist. He saw a person with a depth and a passion that he couldn't even begin to fathom. He thought about his own life, his easy popularity, his casual cruelties that he had always dismissed as just a bit of fun. In the face of such raw, honest expression, his own life felt shallow, transparent, and utterly meaningless. He had wanted to make her feel small for a few minutes, but she had just made him feel like the smallest person in the world, not by mocking him, but by showing him what it meant to be truly big. He was no longer the popular guy looking down on the quiet girl. He was just a kid in the dark who had been lucky enough to get a glimpse of something real. Then, a single sound broke the silence. It was the sound of two hands coming together, slowly, deliberately. It came from the back of the auditorium, from an older music teacher who knew what he had just witnessed. It was a clap of genuine, heartfelt appreciation. It was a spark in a dry forest. Another person joined in, then another. The sound began to build, slowly at first, then with a sudden, unstoppable momentum. It started as a ripple, then grew into a wave. The quiet clapping became a thunderous roar that shook the very foundations of the building. It wasn't just polite applause. It was an explosion of emotion, a release of all the feeling that had been building up in the room. And then people started to get to their feet. First one, then 10, then 50, then the entire auditorium. A standing ovation. It was a spontaneous, unanimous, and overwhelming display of respect and admiration. The popular boy was on his feet before he even realized it, clapping with a force that made his hands sting. He looked around and saw his friends, all of them standing, all of them clapping, their faces stripped of their usual cynical smirks and replaced with the same look of dumbfounded wonder. They were no longer a pack. They were just individuals, moved and humbled by the power of a single girl and her music. On the stage, the girl looked up, her face a mask of shock and exhaustion. She saw the dark shapes of hundreds of people on their feet, heard the wall of sound that was all for her. For a moment she seemed to not understand. Then a slow, shy smile spread across her face. It was the first genuine smile she had shown all night. It transformed her, lighting up her features with a fragile, beautiful light. She clumsily got to her feet, still holding her cello, and gave a small, awkward bow. It wasn't the bow of a seasoned performer. It was the bow of a girl who was surprised and deeply grateful. As she straightened up, the applause only grew louder. She carefully placed her cello back in its case, her hands shaking slightly, and walked off the stage, the roar of the crowd following her like a warm, embracing wave. Back in the audience, the boy remained standing, clapping until his hands were sore. The rest of the talent show felt like an anticlimax, a blurry collection of acts that couldn't possibly compare to what they had just seen. But for him, the show was already over. The joke he had so carefully crafted had turned into a silence, and that silence had turned into a moment of profound, life-changing clarity. He didn't try to find her backstage to apologize. He knew that words would be useless, a cheap attempt to claim a piece of her moment. Instead, he just stood there, letting the memory of the music wash over him, a permanent, beautiful scar on his soul. The joke was long gone, but the silence, and the music that filled it, would stay with him forever.